everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to start talking about more fall, spooky, Samhain related magic and spell work. So this week we're going to be talking about banishing and binding. I was talking on one of my most recent videos, I believe it was my Lilith video, with dream catchers about banishing and binding, and the ethics of it, how you can do it, just if it's safe, if it's acceptable, if it's morally okay. We were discussing that a little bit in the comments, and I thought it would be a good idea to talk more about that in a full video. I'll link the video up here so you can click on that and go read the comments to see exactly what we were talking about. So first of all, thank you to Dreamcatchers for this video idea. And before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I upload new videos every single week, always on a new topic, so subscribe so you don't miss any of my future videos. But to start off, banishings and bindings do kind of have like a lot of dark magic or shadow work or anything that's not necessarily just of love and light. It has kind of a bad rap. Banishings and bindings are a little bit more of a gray area, like a lot of things that are of the shadow and of the darkness. So a lot of people think that banishing and bindings are off limits because they're bad or they're ethically not okay. Which is true in some cases. Like anything, there's a time and place for banishings and bindings, and if you're just running around banishing people, binding people all the time, whenever you want, then that's super inappropriate and definitely not okay. But there are instances when a banishing or a binding not only is helpful, but necessary. So we're going to be talking about that in this video. So first, what is a banishing and what is a binding? So if you don't know much about magic, take a second to check out my video that I posted on magic. I talk about all the different kinds of magic and what they mean in that video, so that'll help you understand this whole video about banishing and bindings if you go check out my video on magic first. So if you haven't seen that, give that a watch. So personally, I mostly do sacred magic, but I do also do some personal magic. Again, if you go watch my video on magic, then you'll know that there's sacred magic, personal magic, and sorcery. And again, if you want to know more about each kind of magic, go check out my video on magic and witchcraft. So banishings and bindings would go in the category of either personal magic or sorcery. Even though banishings and bindings do fall into the realm of sorcery a little bit, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad. They're not inherently bad. It's not something that if you do it, you're suddenly practicing dark magic. It's not like that. The line is not quite so definitive. It's more of a blurry situation. So a banishing would be when you essentially banish something from your life, something or someone. So you could do this to a person, you could do this to a habit that you have, you could do this to a situation or a circumstance that you find yourself in a lot. You can attempt to banish anything, really. So with a banishing, you would essentially be telling whatever it is or whoever it is that you're trying to get rid of, stay away from me. So you would be trying to energetically and through magic keep that person or that thing from you. And then on the other hand, a binding is when you try to connect someone or something to someone. So a binding is kind of the opposite of a banishing. With a banishing, you're telling someone or something, go away, never come back. And with a binding, you're saying, stay with this thing, stay with this person, stay in this place. You're linking someone to something. You can bind a person to a specific place. So say you had someone who was harassing you, you could bind that person to the town that they live in. So that way they can't follow you anywhere. Or I've even seen people do in a friendship kind of way, bind themselves to each other. They bind themselves to their relationship so they cannot leave each other. And then a little bit more on the sorcery side that I would kind of say in my spiritual and magical practice is not okay because I'm Wiccan, I don't do anything that impacts anyone's free will. My magical practice does not harm anyone. If you know the Wiccan Rede and if you've seen my videos on the Wiccan Rede, you'll know that the Wiccan Rede is do what you will, harm none. So I do whatever I want in my magical and spiritual practice as long as it's not going to harm anyone or anything. So this next binding example for me is a off limits area, but one that I do know of is people can bind someone to themselves without their knowledge. So that's kind of where you get in the realm of you're taking away someone's free will. So I would say that that's not okay, but I have heard of people who would meet someone that they like and try to bind them to themselves so that they can't leave them. So a binding is basically tying two things together so that they are never apart for long. And with a binding, because people do have free will, it gets a little complicated. So say if you did bind someone to a town or a state, it's still possible for them to leave that place or that person, but there will be something that will force them to return because they are bound to it. So if, say, you bound someone to their town so that they couldn't follow you to wherever you moved to, they would probably stay living there, but there might be a period of time where they live somewhere else for a couple months, but then for some reason, circumstances require that they move back to where you bound them to. Or maybe they go on a trip, but then their trip gets cut short because you'd used magic to bind them to a place and they left that place. So now circumstances, the universe, energies are forcing them to go back to where you've bound them to. So that person can still leave that place or that person that you have bound them to. If your binding spell was successful, they shouldn't be able to stay away from whatever you bound them to for very long. But again, remember that people do have free will, so if someone does momentarily seem to not be bound to whatever it is that you bound them to, give it a little time and see if that binding takes hold and if they are returned to whatever you bound them to. Because it could just be that there's a momentary problem because of that person's free will. But if your binding spell was successful, then that person will end up returning to whatever you bound them to eventually. And if they don't, then maybe your binding spell wasn't successful, and if you want to try it again, you can try it again. So bindings and banishings can be very useful for protection. And not only protection from others, but also protection from yourself and your inner world. When you're banishing and binding things, you don't necessarily always have to be banishing or binding something tangible. Like I said before, you can banish a bad habit. You can banish an old pattern that you seem to recreate in your relationships. Anything that you want to get rid of, that you want to expel from yourself or from your life, can be banished. Whether it's a tangible object, a place that you don't want to live in anymore, a person that you never want to see again, any of those things can be banished. So this is where the protection aspect comes in. Sometimes people can be inappropriate and unhealthy and even aggressive with you. So in those situations, it can be not only very helpful, but good and necessary to banish that person or bind that person or whatever it is you need to do to keep that person from you. For example, I once had a man who was harassing me, wouldn't leave me alone, and he ended up actually knowing where I lived, so I was very nervous about what he would do and how he would behave, and if he would try to hurt me or wait outside my home and suddenly surprise me with his presence because he was endlessly harassing me. So that was an instance where normally I would not do a banishing or a binding, but because this person was making me feel unsafe and stepping across a boundary that makes me uncomfortable. And I had asked in the mundane world multiple times for this person to back off and leave me alone. And they were ignoring that request from me. That led me to feel like I had no choice. And so I did a banishing. Any situation like that where someone's trying to harm you, or just making you uncomfortable and you have tried in a mundane way to get that to stop and to set a boundary and make it healthy and safe for yourself, and it's still not working, they're still making it difficult, or for whatever reason it's just not settling, the situation isn't going away, then that might be your cue to maybe do a banishing or a binding to protect yourself. So there are people who do banishings and bindings simply for personal gain. There are people who don't like someone for a not valuable or valid reason and will bind them to a place simply because they want to and they think it's fun to kind of mess with them. Or there are people who will bind you to them simply because they don't want to lose you and they don't want to let you leave them. And that's not okay either, because that is infringing on someone's free will. So there is a line, in my opinion, between a banishing or a binding that is in the best interest of yourself, to protect yourself, to keep yourself safe, and draw a healthy boundary when you've already asked that person to stop or knock it off or whatever it is, versus trying to just do things for personal gain, mess with people for the sake of messing with people, and just wreak havoc on the world. That's not okay. So within your own spiritual practice and your religion, take some time to figure out where's the line for you with banishing and binding. I think it's always good to, before you do any magical work, sit down and think about it for a day. Maybe sleep on it. Give the situation some time to settle and some time to figure itself out. And if it's still not good and you're still feeling unsafe and you still need magical help, then take the next step. But never do something in the heat of an emotion. Never do anything when you are coming right off of an upsetting situation or an upsetting interaction. Give yourself time to cool off, reassess the situation, and then decide, do I really need to do this banishing or this binding or whatever it is? So let's talk a little bit about a banishing and a binding that you could do if you're wanting to do one. I believe I've only ever done 3 banishings in my life, and only one of them was a person. The other 2 were personal habits and personal beliefs I had about myself that I wanted to banish. But all these banishings I did the same way. So the way that you do this banishing is sit down at your altar or wherever your sacred space is. Open your sacred space, however it is that you open your sacred space. Maybe you cast a circle, maybe you call on your deities, maybe you call on God and Goddess, maybe you call on your spirit guides if you work with them. You call on whoever it is and whatever it is that you work with. You open that sacred space, that ritual space, and you're ready to start your spell. So for this spell, all you need is a little piece of paper big enough to write whatever it is that you are banishing on. So you'll open that ritual space and you will start to set your intention. And this can be as simple as, in that sacred space, just sitting in it and thinking about what it is that you want to banish. Think about why you want to banish it, what your life will look like once it's banished. That's really important. Definitely really spend a lot of time visualizing your reality without this person or without this problem or without this issue or this item or whatever it is that you're banishing. Really solidify that reality for yourself in your mind. And then once that feels complete, write down on that piece of paper whatever it is or whoever it is that you're banishing. And at this point, if you want to call on any deities or entities to help you with this, now is when you would do it. And you can call on them either verbally out loud. You can literally call on them to come and be present and help you with this banishing. Or you can do it within your mind if you don't feel like you want to say it out loud. They're both just as good. The entity or deity will hear you no matter which way you call on them. And you could call on any deities or entities that make sense to help with a banishing. So any kind of protector spirit, any deities that have to do with boundaries or war or being a warrior, being strong and guided and protected, all those types of deities are really great. So think about who or what it is that you're banishing and then call on a deity that makes sense with that. Maybe you have specific relationships with certain deities, so you could call on that deity because you have a good relationship with them and a good rapport. Whatever makes sense for your spiritual practice. Maybe you don't need or want to call on anyone specific. That's totally fine too. You don't have to. It's just about if you work with deities or not. So at that point, if you do work with any deities or entities that you want to call on, do that then. So then once you've done these things and you're in that sacred space and you've set your intention very strongly, you've got any deities or spirits or entities there helping you with that intention to bring it to fruition, then you're going to write on that piece of paper the name of the person or the thing that you're trying to banish and you're going to place that piece of paper in the freezer. By putting this person's name or this problem that you're having in the freezer, you're banishing it and you're keeping it frozen, locked away, unmoving, unable to follow you. So for example, I once did this with a man, so I wrote the man's name on the piece of paper, asked Lilith to help me with this intention and this banishing, set my intention very strongly at my altar, viewed my life without this man bothering me anymore, felt that that was solidified, felt good with that intention, and then I placed it in the Ziploc bag in the freezer. I never heard from this man ever again. I would say leave that piece of paper in the freezer for as long as is necessary. I would say don't leave it forever. Definitely don't leave it forever. If you leave it forever, it could end up turning into something that you don't really want. Like that person could become unable to move forward in their own life, even separate from you. You could be banishing them a little too hard. So I would say leave that piece of paper in the freezer for as long as you need. So maybe you put that piece of paper in the freezer and then they reach out to you one more time. Leave the piece of paper in the freezer until you stop hearing from them. Or if you're banishing a pattern that you have or a habit that you have, leave that piece of paper in the freezer until that habit goes away and you're not tempted to recreate that pattern. So that could be a few days, that could be a few weeks, that could be a couple months, but definitely don't leave that piece of paper in the freezer forever. And once your banishing is complete and it's been some time and you feel like the thing or the person is completely banished and you don't need to keep that piece of paper in the freezer anymore, you can take that piece of paper out and you can do a couple things. Some people don't feel weird about the remnants of their spells, so they just kind of discard them in whatever way's easiest. I've seen people just throw out in the trash their spell scraps. That makes me feel a little anxious. That doesn't make me feel like it's correct for the spell. So personally, what I would do, I like to, at the end of a spell, transmute whatever waste I have left from the spell back into something good and beneficial for the earth. So with something like this where all you have left from a spell is a little piece of paper, I would say bury it outside. So now for an example of a binding. For this binding spell, you're going to start out the same way you did for the banishing spell, in your sacred space, at your altar, or wherever it is that you do spells and magic, calling on your deities and your entities, your spirit guides, casting a circle, however it is that you open your sacred space. So you can do this either with 2 candles and a string, or you can simply visualize it. It's up to you and your ability to get these supplies and also just what feels right to you. Sometimes it can help to have the tangible supplies with you so that you can see the spell working, and also have something to focus on during your spell while you're trying to form this intention. So you don't have to have these supplies. It's up to you. Some people like having the supplies and like having the thing to focus on, where other people like to just do their spells more inward and more just with their deities and their spirits and with themselves and without any of the fuss of items. But it's up to you. It doesn't matter whether or not you have the 2 candles and the string or if you just have your own mind. The spell will work either way. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to spend a couple minutes just sitting in that circle, in that sacred space with your deities and your entities and your spirits, whoever it is that you called on, and you're going to focus on your intention. Focus on what it is that you're trying to bind together. Maybe you're trying to bind together 2 people. Maybe you're trying to bind a person to a place. It could be any 2 things that you're trying to bind together. Focus on that intention. Again, like we did with the banishing, focus on what life would look like with those 2 things bound together strongly. How would things be different? How would things be the same? How would things be better? How would things be worse? Really form that reality of those 2 things bound together in your mind. While you're doing this, once you've spent a couple minutes doing it and you feel like it's strong in your mind, continue to do this in your mind. Think about your intention, thinking about binding those 2 things together. And then you're going to start to tie the 2 candles together. And you want the candles to be about 6 inches apart, roughly. So you don't want them to be right next to each other. You want them to kind of be one here, both in a stand, so they're standing up tall. And then use a string to tie one, and then bring the string across and tie the other candle. So the two candles are tied together. Not necessarily super tightly, but they're both connected. And while you're tying these candles together, you're thinking about your intention. And at this point is when you can start to say things, if that's part of your practice. Some people like to be very inward and they don't like to be verbal during spells or rituals. I do both, depending on the situation. So at this point, if you feel called to, you can say out loud that you are binding blank and blank together. And you can even add on to that you're binding with the help of blank, either an entity's name or a deity's name, or with the help of my spirit guides, or even you could just say, with all of me, I bind this and this together. So say it in whatever way that you feel called to say it. You can then move on to doing some visualization. So now you want to visualize the binding happening between those two things. So if it's two people, you can visualize this invisible cord tying them together, connecting them. Or if it's a person and a place that you're binding, you can imagine an invisible cord tying that person to that spot on the earth. So once you feel that you can very intensely visualize whatever two things or people that you're binding together, you can visualize that cord really, really well to the point where it feels really strong and it's not going to break, then your binding is complete. So then you would want to thank whoever or whatever it is that helped you to achieve this binding. You're going to close your sacred space and your binding is complete. And you can even take this spell a step further. If you're binding two things or two people together, you can carve the name of whatever or whoever you're binding together on each candle. So you could bind one person's name on one candle and another person's name on the other candle, or bind the name on one candle and the place on the other candle. That's another thing that you can do to strongly represent each thing that you're binding in the candles. So that is all about binding and banishing. I hope that this was helpful. Keep in mind that you are responsible for any spell work and magic that you do, so don't do anything without really thinking about it first and making sure that you're okay with whatever this creates. Remember that at the end of the day, you don't want to be responsible for something bad happening or something unhealthy happening to someone. You want to feel good about your spiritual practice, and if you're like me and you're Wiccan and you believe in the threefold law, what you do will come back to you threefold. So only put out what is really necessary to put out what you want in the world, give what you want to get. So my advice to you would be only do bindings and banishings as a last resort and out of love and out of light. Do them for protection, do them for strength. So think everything through and you'll be all right. I hope this video was helpful and that you feel a little bit more well-versed in banishings and bindings. If you try one of these out, let me know how it goes. If you have any questions, leave those down in the comments. And if you have any video requests, leave those in the comments also. I love to take requests. It's always good to know what you guys are thinking and what you guys are wanting to learn about. Don't forget to give this video a like if you found it helpful and you enjoyed it. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye.